Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. I cannot see what you see at this point. Can you guys let me know if you see my notes screen or if you see the actual presentation? If you can just type that into the questions section there on your bar, I would appreciate that to make sure that I've got the right screen up for you. Okay. In the meantime, welcome to the top 3 fraud risks vendor teams need to watch out for in 2021 and what can combat them. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. We will send you a link to the recording within 3 days, but most likely it will be tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. I will save them for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. If I don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked via email. And then make sure you download the handouts. It is a PDF of, there are 2, it's a PDF of the presentation, and then also a 2021 training schedule for the vendor team training paths that we will talk about in the presentation. Okay, thank you. Someone did let me know that they can see the presentation versus the notes pages, so thanks for that. All right, so we will go on just a little bit about me for those of you that are new here. I first want to introduce myself. I am Debra R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. As a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 requests per month, I also had the opportunity while at that Fortune 15 company, along with the payroll manager, since that was the other function where cyber criminals were applying social engineering tactics. But together, we implemented over 70 internal controls and best practices to mitigate fraud for both accounts payable and payroll teams. So I now work with vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add in those authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices that eliminate fraud, regulatory fines, and just bad vendor data overall. I do have a dedicated site to the vendor setup and maintenance process where I have quite a few free resources and tools, including the blog, podcast, on-demand webinars, some free downloads to help you with that vendor process. And I'll have a link to that, or there's a link to that in the presentation. So that'll come up and it's in your handout as well. All right, so taking a look at the agenda, we will first look at 2020 fraud trends affecting vendor teams. Then we'll talk about 2021, what that fraud outlook is for the vendor teams. And then we will review those top 3 fraud risks for vendor teams in 2021 and how vendor teams can protect themselves, their vendors, and the organization. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So let's talk about 2020 fraud trends. It goes unsaid that this has been a year. And one of the things, the first thing I want to point out is that Merchant Savvy reported that global losses from payment fraud tripled from $10 billion in 2011 to $30 billion in 2020. And so I said that just to make the point that it's not just related to COVID-19. Fraud or payment fraud has consistently been on the rise for years. The next thing that we saw in 2020 that really increased was spoofed domains. According to Proofpoint, 3.1 billion domain spoofing emails are sent per day. And this happens because there are now companies out there that will sell the SSL certificate, but they're not actually checking the actual site. So the days when you could, check for that padlock icon in the address bar just can't be, that can't be trusted anymore. Even the FBI issued an alert in November of 2020, and they listed almost 100. But it's not just spoofed domains. Instances where fraudsters were spoofing webmail and SharePoint sites were also seen. So an increase here means that the vendor team could be clicking on links that they think are for the vendor, but are not. And then the last thing I wanted to show is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They reported in their fraud in the wake of COVID-19 benchmarking report. And by the way, if you haven't gone to their site or downloaded this report, they have a lot of information on fraud, but they really have the most information I've seen on occupational fraud. But they found that 79% of the respondents of a survey that they did in November 2020, 79% of those respondents observed an increase in fraud. Not only that, but even a higher number, 90% expect an increase in fraud over the next 12 months. Now, Jason Johnson wrote an article, and there is a link to it if you'd like to read that. It'll be in your PDF handout. But he wrote an article called The State of Invoice and Payment Fraud Heading into 2021. And in it, he stated that the first step to safeguarding any organization is to raise awareness. So let's raise some awareness with the 2021 fraud outlook. Oh, I do have a poll question, but first we're going to do our first poll question. So let me go ahead and get that launched. Okay, so the first poll question is, do you have a separate department that handles security awareness training and fraud reporting? Now, that could be your information technology or IT department. It could be your information security or InfoSec department. It can be another department, or you may have none. Now, I mentioned that when I was with a Fortune 15 company, myself and the payroll manager implemented internal controls and best practices and authentication techniques. And we did that with the help of an information security team. So we had a whole department that was separate from information technology, from IT, but I know in some companies, again, depending on the size, that security awareness and fraud reporting could be handled in IT or another department. So I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to respond, and then we will take a look at the results. All right, so we're going to close that out. All right, so taking a look at the results of the poll, we can see that, it's even 33% information technology, 33% information security, and 33% have none. Okay, so it's even across the board. All right, so now we're going to go on from there. All right, so now onto the 2021 fraud outlook. So these are the top 3 fraud risks for 2021 that I've identified. And the first one being occupational fraud or internal fraud. Now, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, that organization or association published a December 2020 report. Again, the fraud in the wake of COVID-19, and that reported a 13% significant increase and a 35% slight increase in employee embezzlement that was observed as of November 2020. And then an article by law.com entitled Employee Embezzlement in the Times of COVID-19 reported that between April and September 2020, the U.S. unemployment ranged from 7.9% to 14.7%, which has triggered a financial stress, no surprise there, on a large portion of the population. And that stress means that there is pressure, and pressure is one of the fraud triangle's 3 elements, along with opportunity and rationalization. For the future, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners see a 71% increase expected in 2021 for occupational fraud, 47% slight increase, and a 24% significant increase again over the next 12 months. Now, the next one is phishing. Human engineering, it's old, but it's new again. The definition of phishing is the fraudulent practice of making phone calls or even leaving voice messages purporting to be from reputable companies in order to induce individuals to reveal sensitive information like bank account details, credit card numbers. It's the same as phishing that's done via email, except it's done via voice. And that's why it's called phishing. But it is very successful. Why? Because the voice is the oldest form of communication, and it's actually the best method to pull on our emotional strings, far more than an email would be. Now, why is this all of a sudden increasing? Well, the problem, as most vendor teams and vendors went remote, is that the phone system, may not have been, and for some still isn't, accessible when we're forced, where the vendor teams and or the vendors are forced to use their cell phones, and actually internal employees as well. Deep fakes, spoofing telephone numbers are all trending upwards in 2021. And according to an article entitled "Phishing Attacks on Remote Workers on the Rise," the FBI has warned of increased phishing attacks and say they have a high success rate, especially now that we have remote workers that are isolated and distracted. All right, the third one, no surprise here, business email compromise. Abnormal Security reported in their quarterly BEC report that business email compromise rose by 81% from quarter 2 2020 to quarter 3 2020. They also found that COVID-related attacks decreased, except for invoice and payment fraud. So it's not going anywhere. Another interesting note was that attackers, because we all know that fraudsters evolve, so attackers during 2020 shifted their targets from individual finance employee mailboxes to group mailboxes. So if you've got those group AP mailboxes or procurement mailboxes where you're routing your vendors through those, that's where the attackers are increasing their attacks in 2020. They did that, and that trend is going to remain in 2021. Another thing with business email compromise, for those that have vendors, or if your entity is located in the UK, is that Brexit. So Brexit has already started to cause some business email compromise issues in the second half of 2020. The Bank of Ireland's fraud team kind of thwarted an attempted business email scam to the tune of $2.56 million, where they were the fraudsters were trying to change a vendor's bank account to their own bank account, and the reason behind that was that they were changing their bank account due to Brexit, due to the requirements of Brexit. So, and I get that, because in order to get the favorable exchange rate, right? So you'll have, or conversion rate, you'll have, typically you'll have a bank in that same country. And so the banking for some of your UK vendors may change. And so fraudsters are already taking advantage of that potential change due to Brexit. Okay. So we have our three: occupational fraud, phishing, and business email compromise. So I just mentioned the expectation is for occupational fraud to increase by 71% in the next 12 months. So let's talk about how we can combat that. All right, so I read, and I don't have the name of the article, I may have seen it on LinkedIn, but securing remote employees, I read that is the top 2021 cybersecurity challenge for organizations. And you may have already seen this issue in yours, as teams abruptly switched to remote work in March and April. And what they find is that controls are challenged, as policies are more difficult to enforce and monitor. The flexibility in the working hours makes unusual paths more usual. So say, for example, you can't now just look for a transaction that's being done at an odd time to find that internal fraud or occupational fraud, because with work from home and folks are also homeschooling kids, work was just being done at odd times. Also, there were segregation of duties issues that were created because of layoffs, furloughs, what have you, based on COVID. Maybe not all of your team members were able to get up and running as everyone went home, so there's less staff to do the work. So the way to control or to combat internal or occupational fraud is to control the opportunity portion of the fraud triangle. So the fraud triangle, again, is opportunity, rationalization, and pressure. Now, pressure and rationalization are all on the team member, but opportunity is what companies can control. So let's start with the first one, check print in the office. The physical controls of having the checks, the signature, USB, if you have one, as well as the checks themselves that have not been mailed, having those locked in the office is a control that just cannot be replicated in employees' homes. And I know many APT members that were designated as essential and were able to go into the office for the check run. But I have also heard reports of employees that did not go into the office, and so they took those check printers, along with micro ink, the USB, signature USB in some cases not, but they took all that to their homes, and that forced employees now to do things like leaving the checks in the driveway so that the leadership could come in and sign. And, you know, I just can't imagine that many of the controls that we're going to talk about can be done, you know, in those check signing scenarios. Now, many AP teams, and you may have been one of them, move their vendors to ACH payments to eliminate these types of workarounds. But I do find that most folks or most AP teams still have check payments. But even with ACH payments, there can also be occupational or internal fraud in ACH payments. But fortunately, the controls we talk about, we're going to talk about, can mitigate those as well. All right, so we talked about the check print. Next is, you know, if you have the staff, then you need to focus on segregation of duties, where one person does not have the ability to create a vendor, post an invoice, and generate the payment. Then rotate those positions, so if there is any internal fraud unchecked, even collusion, then the rotation of those duties, even temporarily with mandatory vacations, will stop it. Now, if you don't have the staff and cannot do one or all three of these, you can implement these next compensating controls that are meant to be done when there is a segregation of duties issue. Now, the first one is to require management approval for new vendor setups and existing vendor changes. And with that, it just means you want to require approval for all new vendor adds and vendor changes. You also want to require supporting documentation, including the source of the add or the change request. And this may be a change if you previously filed the vendor supporting documentation on a random drive or folder, or even hard copy. You really need to require the supporting documentation electronically and then attach it to the vendor record so that management can easily assess it. And then when we get to the management piece, we want to have, or the management review piece, we want to have management review all new vendor setups and vendor changes. And we want to do that prior to payment runs. So for new vendor setups, you want to look for vendors that were just added and already have a payment. You also want to look for vendors that have had changes in banking or remit addresses that were changed prior to the payment run. And those include those instances where that information was changed and then changed back quickly. So make sure the reporting can show that. For each change, your system should maintain an audit log that will tell you the date, the time, and the user making the change at a minimum. And then you also want to cross-check that the vendor address or vendor banking, if changed, does not match the employee's address or banking. And you may need to collaborate with payroll and or IT for this one if you don't have access to those records, which you probably should not anyway. But if you don't already have access, you don't need to get it. All you need to do is to have a way for that validation or that check to be done in the background, and then have that team, IT, whomever's doing that, notify you if there is ever a match. And then the next one is for management to review the pay cycles prior to releasing payments. And this is at the invoice level. So now you're looking at the invoices. Review invoices for existing vendors to ensure the invoice numbering is consistent with historical invoice numbers. Review the backup for any non-PO invoicing. Again, this is not something that can be done from a driveway. And I actually had a client that would review invoices or payments for any vendors where the payment exceeded a specific specific amount. So you can definitely customize the reports of that are generated for management to review, but make sure that there's some management review of the pay cycles at the invoice level prior to releasing payments. And then the last one is definitely to inactivate those vendors on a monthly, quarterly, or at the very least annual basis. Review your vendor master and inactivate those vendors that have not had invoices, purchase orders, payments, or changes to their vendor record in 12, 15, or 18 months. And this is important because it will reduce the number of vendors that management needs to be concerned with, reduce the potential for fraud because the record will not be available to select in error or in an intentional event to perpetrate fraud. And then another important thing is once you inactivate them, require that all inactive vendors follow the same process for new vendor setups, because the other point of that is to make sure that you always have updated information, so you're not getting fined for the legal name and tax ID not matching. You're not getting fined because a vendor has subsequently been added to one of the watch lists like OFAC. Okay. So that is how to combat internal occupational fraud. Okay. Now, the next one, let's talk about phishing and how to combat. All right, so Stu Soldierman, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he is the CEO of KnowBe4, and KnowBe4 provides phishing, like phishing and fraud reporting and training. And he said in an article entitled, "Here's some powerful ammo to grab more of your end-of-year InfoSec budget." He said that bad guys consider your user the most rewarding attack surface. It takes 3 months to hack hardware, 3 weeks to hack software, and 3 minutes, if that, to hack a human. Now, in the article, he was really referring to email, but it's the same with phishing. Again, voice is the oldest form of communication, and it is the best way to invoke that emotional element into the fraud attempt. Think of that baby crying, that sense of urgency. It's very effective on a phone call. So one way to combat is the authentication of the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee. And I talked before about deep fakes, and in this world of deep fakes and telephone number spoofing, you don't know who's calling you. So you need to initiate phone calls or have a way to verify who you are talking to for those inbound calls. Authenticate them by asking 2 to 3 questions that only the vendor or an employee should know, and that the AP or vendor team member has access to. I did do some authentication workshops last year where we went through and customized an authentication reference template that the attendees, their whole teams could use. And with that information, you can ask for elements from different resources such as the vendor record, the invoice, the PO, and even if you have a vendor portal, from the vendor portal. You should definitely have at least 4 to 5 to choose from, so the vendor is not asking the same questions, being asked the same questions each time. And then also separate them into categories and require one from each category. So for example, don't let them ask, don't let the vendor team team asks the vendor or caller requester for an invoice number and an invoice date, because an intercepted invoice can give the fraudster that information. It's better to ask for an invoice number and maybe the last 4 digits of the tax ID. So, you know, something from the invoice, something from the vendor record. And you want to do the same thing for employees. I do have a template where for employees we can look at like hierarchy plus maybe their cubicle number. Now, I no longer offer those authentication workshops separately, but I do offer them in the vendor process team training paths that we'll talk about a little later. And so the next thing, really, I advocate, you know, that the best thing is to eliminate that phone call. You know, do you have a vendor self-registration portal or any tool that vendors use to submit invoices, check payment status, I don't know, submit bids? If that tool has a messaging or upload capability, use it. And you want to use it because it provides authentication through the login process. Now, we talked about authentication manually with you asking, you know, 2 to 3 questions that the vendor or employee should know, you know, the same way the bank does when you call. But you don't have to do that if you're using a tool, because the tool provides authentication through the login process. One thing I do want to note is to make sure you check with your IT or information security team or your third-party provider to make sure that that tool's infrastructure is stable. I once had a client where I registered, signed into their portal, and for the entire 2-week project, I never had to sign in again. I just typed in part of the URL and I was in. So you definitely want to make sure that that tool does not have that problem. And I do have a video on this on my YouTube channel, and I've included a link to the YouTube channel on the Connect With Me slide. So definitely take a look at that. Now, another options that companies have implemented in 2020 just to move that communication out of email is tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, where you can have external members and have communication through those tools that are more secure, because you do have to register and sign in. So there are other tools that you can use. If you have a vendor platform, no matter what it's for, you can use that if it has a messaging or upload capability, or you can use tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams. All right, so that was phishing, and that brings us to our second poll question, and I'm going to launch that. And I ask this question a lot actually during my webinars, and it is, do you validate bank account ownership? And if you do, how do you currently do it? Are you using early warning or their reseller GIAC? Are you using NSNOX? And we'll talk about, you know, what makes them different on a subsequent slide. Are you using the bank and the beneficial owner or the know your customer option? Or is there another third-party provider, like a payment solution provider, that handles the liability and the responsibility for collecting payments? Or you do not verify bank account ownership. Okay, so I'll give about 10 more seconds, and then I'll share the results. All right, so let me close that out and let me share. Okay, 100% we do not verify bank account ownership. Okay, so I don't know if I bring it up in a later slide or not, but I do have on my website, I have a blog that I think it's titled Free and Paid Bank Account Validation Resources or something like that. I did it in the month of December. So definitely check that out, but I may have some information here as well as we talk about how to combat business email compromise. Okay. All right, so top fraud risk 3, business email compromise. So let's look at how we can combat that. So business email compromise, no surprise, it's been trending. As a matter of fact, it was on my top 3 fraud risks going into 2020 from last year. But what's worse now is that it increased in 2020. And partially because fraudsters are so successful with those phishing attempts, with the between the realistic domain spoofing and other evolved tactics. Now they have more login credentials, and you know the bad thing is that they may be in your vendor's accurate email. So you can no longer count on verifying that the email address is valid, and so the email request must be valid, because email account takeover is rising because they have login credentials, and so that email is coming from that vendor's valid email account. So you just can no longer count on that. And as a matter of fact, I had one vendor reach out to me because this happened to him, and the company paid the invoice, made the bank account change, of course, because that's what the fraudsters did, paid to the fraudster's bank account. And so when the vendor who contacted me contacted their buyer indicated that they were not going to try to get a reversal. They were not going to pay that vendor because it's on the vendor because of that email account takeover. Now, I don't know what happened in that instance. I know he was opposing that. I don't know if the stance that the company took was something that was supported, but just know that, you know, getting that valid email address and verifying that the domain is valid is just no longer something that you can count on. And I know your IT team is responsible for making sure that they block fraudulent emails, but they're not going to block an email that where the email address is valid. And even when it's not valid and it's not blocked, it doesn't always happen because they get past firewalls and everything. Those fraudulent emails, they're not 100% caught. So you need to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. So the weakest link in the security chain, which is the user, so you and your team can prevent attacks. So you need to, as Chef Emerald Lagasse says, you know, kick it up a notch. So let's see how we can kick it up a notch. So the first way is company branded ACH form, and require authenticating data on that form. Require that form, change it every year. So you know if you get an old one, it could be fraud. Include required information such as the tax ID, existing banking information, especially if they're changing it, and don't let them tell you they don't have access. If they don't, the person you're dealing with doesn't have access, you're just talking to the wrong person. They have it, they have to keep that information for 7 years. So include on this form the information that will authenticate the vendor to you. Tax ID is one, existing banking information is another. You can also ask for the last 3 deposit dates and amounts. Just make sure you put some authenticating data and make that required on that company branded ACH form. The next one, of course, is the confirmation phone call or email. And I say that because I do have a webinar on how to eliminate the phone call using authentication of the requester and authentication of the data, which does include the company branded ACH form I was just talking about. So you can check that out on my site. And in this webinar, it was earlier this year, I believe in May. And again, it was because with the abrupt move to remote, vendor teams just could not reach the vendors for that confirmation phone call. I mean, it was hard enough when everyone was in the office to reach the vendor for that confirmation of a banking change or remit address change. So it just got worse with everyone moving to remote. And also you want to remember to document the attempts until successful so the confirmation does not slip through the cracks. All right, so the next one is validating the bank account ownership. So now there are several services out there that can validate bank account ownership, meaning tying the vendor legal name to the bank account holder's name. And due to regulations like Know Your Customer, they can even tie the tax ID that was used to set up the bank account to your vendor's tax ID. So you can match that too. Most of you probably already know about early warning and their reseller GIAC. But one thing to note about them is that they're limited to US banks because they're using a database that US banks voluntarily submit their depositor information to. But there is also a platform called NSNOX, and NSNOX does include international banks because they use a pre-know process, so it includes both domestic and international banks. If you want more information, I know I've done some blogs about it. It's in the blog I told you about with the free or paid resources for bank validation, so definitely check that out, or you can just reach out to me directly and I will point you in the right direction there. Now, the next one is to send a notification to vendors. So the same way that Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, your bank, your credit card company sends you a notification each time any piece of your information on your profile changes, you need to do the same thing with your vendors. That includes, and be sure to include AP contact information in case the vendor needs to reach out to you because they did not initiate the change. That way, you don't have to wait until your vendor notices that their payment has not been received. And at that point anyway, it's probably too late to recover the funds. Oh, and if you don't have the email address, send it to the remit or tax address that you have on file. The next one is least privilege access. You want to limit who has access to sensitive information and who has access to add or change a vendor. Do a security role audit to ensure that there is no access that causes a segregation of duties issue. And make it a recurring audit to catch those folks that left the company or transferred to another department and their access wasn't removed. Now, the next one is to mask the tax ID and the bank account because and this is even within the AP team. Not everyone in AP needs to see the full tax ID. They can match the vendor record using the last 4 digits. And they definitely don't need to see the full bank account. And for that matter, they don't need to see the bank routing number at all. The less information and access they have, the less they can reveal if they are being vished. I don't know if I just made up a word, but if they're a victim of vishing, then and they don't have access to that type of sensitive information, then they just can't give it out. And then the last thing is a vendor policy, because all of these controls you're putting into place to eliminate fraud need some support. So create a vendor management policy or add it to your current AP policy and include all the requirements for your vendor adds and changes, such as the company branded ACH form, and have leadership sign off on it. Because these, and many of you may already know, are not going to be popular changes because they do take more time. But we know they're necessary to reduce fraud. And this is your document to tell internal employees how to do business with the vendor team. You can even use it as a basis for your vendor welcome letter to tell vendors how to do business with your company when changes are necessary or if they have inquiries. Okay. So that is business email compromise. Now we're going to go to the third poll question. And let me bring that up really quick and launch it. Okay, so this one is a simple yes or no, could be not sure, but do you have any security awareness training? I bring this up, or I think it's an important question, because I don't know if you guys known, I'm aware of hearing about, team members being let go because they fell for fraud in the US. I've heard of terminations, but in the UK, there was an instance where someone fell for a fraud and that team member was actually sued. She lost her job, she was sued, and then the judge eventually did side or rule in her favor because he indicated, one, they had not had training in a few years, because sometimes it's just a checkbox thing, and then two, he felt that she acted in an appropriate way, as anyone would if they received that business email compromise email that we're so familiar with. But the point is that she indicated that, even though the judge ruled in her favor, that she just considers herself unemployment. But security awareness training could have avoided that, which they had not had in years. So I've got everyone voted here. So let's look at the results. All right, so we have 40% yes, 40% no, and 20% not sure. So I'm probably going to move that 20% up into the no, because if you're not sure, it means you haven't had it. So so let's talk about how we can mitigate that. So all these authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices I have in my vendor process team training pass. It's new this year. One rate, whole team training is solved. And what it includes is weekly Thursday live training sessions, which you can take a look at the 2021 training schedule. That is a handout, and you can see them all. They're all scheduled for 2021, and I'll get 2022 out in the latter half of this year. So you get weekly Thursday live training sessions. You get weekly Friday Q&A sessions, and it's a drop-in. I have the line open for 2 hours. You can come in, ask your question, or drop out. Doesn't matter. You can stay, listen to other people's questions. That's fine. Also monthly, I will track new frauds, and I actually have new scam alerts that you can subscribe to on my website. And monthly, we'll look at those new scam alerts and new frauds and identify how best to combat those. You also get my free downloads, which is an e-guide, and then all the templates and the forms that I have: vendor setup forms, vendor communication templates, desktop procedure templates, and it does include a custom or company branded ACH form template as well. Okay. Now, with that, I do want to extend, because you are an attendee of this webinar, I am extending what actually it ended December 31st, but it was a discount. Early access 10 is a discount code that you can use through Monday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, and you can get 10% off. But also on my website, feel free to go on there. Again, I have a ton of free resources, a free vendor validation reference list that actually has resource links, so you can make sure you're validating your vendor data as much as you can prior to vendor setup. I've got a free desktop procedure template. I have a free W8 expiration date tracking form, which, you know, we're dealing with that. You should be dealing with that now as new W8s that expire 12/31 were due to be collected. And then I talked about before, I have a lot of free and on-demand webinars. Okay. All right, and then this is just how to connect with me. I have a link to my YouTube channel where I have a Vendor Master File Tip of the Week. And I actually have, I won't put this one on there, but all my free and on-demand webinars are on my YouTube channel, and they have timestamps. So you can skip around to whatever sections you want to go to. So make sure you check out my YouTube channel and subscribe. I also have a Put in the AP and Happy podcast, and then you can also follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Okay. And so now we're come to the Q&A portion. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put them in the questions section, and I will go through them now. Let's see. All right, I see one, and that is what is the cost of the vendor team training pass? Oh, I didn't say that, did I? It's $949 a year for the, and that's unlimited team members. So if you've got, you know, if you're your team, that's fine. If you've got, you know, 20 people on your team, all in accounts payable, bring them all in. As long as they have the same email domain, or they have a email domain that's a subsidiary of your company. And then again, you do get 10% off of that if you sign up by Monday, 11:59 p.m. And that brings that cost down to $854.10. Now, I also have a 1-month option. If you and your team would like to just try it out, you can sign up for $99 and you can cancel that at any time. Any other questions? Okay, so I don't see any questions, any additional questions. If you do have any questions that you think about afterwards, feel free to email me at Debra@DebraRRichardson.com. I will reply back with the answer. And again, a recording of this webinar will be made available, and you'll get a link to it tomorrow. And actually, I think I said it wouldn't be on YouTube, but actually this one will be on YouTube as well. But you'll get a link to the recording, but the YouTube version will have the timestamps if you want to jump around. So I thank everyone for attending, and this concludes this webinar.